The meeting room went silent the moment Victoria Hale set down her tablet and told Ryan Cole to stand up. Every eye in the room turned toward him, the quiet warehouse worker in the worn jacket, who never said much and never caused trouble. Victoria's voice was flat, almost clinical, as she told him the surveillance footage had already been reviewed. A valuable item was missing, and the camera had placed him at the scene. Ryan stood there, surrounded by colleagues who had already made up their minds, and said 3 words nobody expected. Play it again. Ryan Cole had worked at Hale Logistics for 3 years, without ever drawing attention to himself, which was exactly the way he preferred it. He handled the inventory with a precision that the automated system couldn't match, and left without lingering in the break room or joining the after-work drinks that the sales team organized every other Friday. He wore the same rotation of clothes, clean, functional, nothing remarkable, and drove a truck old enough that a few of his colleagues had quietly joked it belonged in a salvage yard. Nobody was cruel about it, not openly. But the way people's eyes moved past him in the hallway said enough. The company itself was the kind of place that rewarded performance loudly and punished mediocrity quietly. Hale Logistics had grown from a regional freight operation into a mid-sized logistics firm with corporate clients across 6 states, and the culture had grown with it, polished, competitive, and deeply sensitive to appearances. People here wore their salaries and the cut of their blazers. They talked about Q3 projections over lunch and dropped the names of clients the way others dropped vacation destinations. Ryan didn't fit any of that, and he had long stopped pretending he might. He had a system. He knew the warehouse floor the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Every shelf number, every misrouted package, every recurring error in the intake logs. His supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Greg Halford, had told Victoria Hale directly during a quarterly review that Ryan was the reason their inventory accuracy sat at 97%. Victoria had nodded, made a note, and moved on. That was the ceiling for someone like Ryan. Acknowledged in data, invisible in person. Derek Sims, on the other hand, was the kind of man who filled a room the moment he walked into it. He was a senior operations manager, mid-40s, well-dressed, the sort of person who remembered everyone's name and used it often. He had Victoria's ear on budget matters and was considered a serious candidate for the VP of Operations role that had been quietly discussed for the past several months. People trusted Derek instinctively, the way people trust anyone who moves through the world, as though they belong everywhere they stand. The item that went missing on a Tuesday morning was a prototype scanner, a compact piece of hardware that had been loaned to the company by a vendor for an internal evaluation. It wasn't irreplaceable, but it was expensive, somewhere in the range of $4,000. And more critically, it was the kind of thing that shouldn't vanish inside a secured facility. When the vendor's contact called to arrange its return, and the device couldn't be located, the company's operations director flagged it immediately. By noon, Victoria Hale knew about it. She reviewed the situation the way she reviewed everything methodically, and without sentiment. The security team pulled the footage from the hallway outside the equipment storage room, where the scanner had last been logged. They found a clear image of Ryan Cole, time-stamped at 7:42 in the morning, standing in the corridor and reaching toward the shelving unit near the door. His back was partially to the camera. Whatever he picked up, he tucked against his side before walking away. The footage was 17 seconds long. Victoria called an all-staff meeting for 2 o'clock. The conference room held about 40 people when it was full, and it was full that afternoon. Employees stood along the back wall when the chairs ran out. Nobody had been told the specific reason for the meeting, but the energy in the room was the kind that comes before a storm. Tight, watchful, aware that something was about to happen. Victoria stood at the front without notes, her posture the same as it always was, straight, composed, and carrying the particular authority of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to make a point. She explained the situation in plain terms. A piece of equipment was missing. The security footage had been reviewed. And then she looked directly at Ryan and asked him to stand up. The room didn't gasp. It did something quieter and worse than that. It went still in a way that felt coordinated, as though every person in it had simultaneously decided to stop breathing. Ryan was seated near the middle of the room, and the heads that turned toward him did so with a speed that made the motion visible as a wave. He was the warehouse worker in the worn jacket. He was the man nobody really knew. And now every face in the room was waiting for him to do something. Victoria told him what the footage showed. She kept her tone even almost administrative, the way a person speaks when they've already made up their mind, but want the process to look thorough. She said the company took security incidents seriously. She said the device needed to be returned. She didn't use the word thief. She didn't need to. Ryan looked at the screen where the footage was now displayed, a still frame showing his own back. His arm angled toward the shelf, the timestamp frozen at 7:42. He could feel the weight of 40 sets of eyes pressing into him like a physical thing, and he understood with complete clarity what was happening. The evidence looked the way it looked. His circumstances looked the way they looked. He was the most convenient answer to the question the room was already asking. He had a choice in that moment, and he knew it. He could say nothing except the implied accusation and see how things played out with HR later, quiet, contained, manageable. Or he could speak now in front of everyone and risk looking like a man who protests too loudly because he has something to hide. Neither option was clean, but staying silent felt like something close to surrender, and Ryan Cole had not managed 3 years in this building by surrendering to things that weren't true. He stood up straight and met Victoria's gaze without looking away. "I didn't take it," he said. His voice was level. Not loud, not defensive, just clear. "Whatever you think you saw in that footage, I didn't take the scanner. I wasn't even in that storage room." Victoria's expression didn't shift. "The camera shows you at the location." "The camera shows me in the hallway," Ryan said. "Those aren't the same thing." Someone near the back of the room exhaled sharply, the kind of exhale that functions as a commentary. A few people exchanged glances. Ryan didn't look at any of them. He kept his attention on Victoria, because she was the only person in the room whose response actually mattered. "Then what were you doing there?" she asked. "I was checking the intake logs on the secondary shelf unit. There was a discrepancy in the previous night's count, and I wanted to verify it before the morning report." He said it plainly, as though reciting a fact rather than mounting a defense. "I picked up a clipboard that had been left on the bottom shelf. That's what's in the footage." Victoria looked at him for a moment that stretched past comfort. Then she looked at the security team representative standing near the door, a man named Paul Greer, who had worked with the company for 6 years and had the careful expression of someone trying not to take sides. "We'll need to verify that," she said. "I'd expect nothing less," Ryan said. And then he sat back down. The meeting ended without a formal conclusion, which was somehow worse than if it had ended with one. Victoria told the room that the investigation was ongoing and that she expected everyone to maintain discretion. People filed out in clusters, and the whispers started before half of them had cleared the doorway. Ryan heard fragments. Without trying to, that footage was pretty clear. And I mean, look at the guy. And why would he even be there that early? All of it threading together into the same familiar shape. They weren't saying anything that surprised him. They were just confirming what he had already known walking into this room, that in the absence of a more complicated story, people would always choose the simple one. Derek Sims passed him near the door on the way out, close enough that Ryan caught the scent of expensive cologne. Derek gave him a brief sympathetic look, the kind that manages to convey, "I'm on your side, and this doesn't look good for you at the same time," and then kept moving without a word. Ryan walked back to the warehouse floor and resumed his shift. There was still work to be done, and nobody had told him to stop. He thought about the clipboard. He knew exactly where it was. He had set it back on the shelf after recording the discrepancy the same way he always did. The numbers would be in the system. The correction was logged with a timestamp. He had the evidence he needed to support what he'd said. What he didn't yet understand was that having the right answer and being allowed to give it are two entirely different things. The next morning, the warehouse felt different, in a way that had nothing to do with the building itself. The lights were the same. The shelving units were the same. The intake logs loaded on the same terminal Ryan had used for 3 years. But the people moved differently around him, now not avoiding him, exactly just recalibrating the way people do when someone has been labeled, and they aren't sure yet how close they want to stand to that label. His supervisor, Greg Halford, stopped by the terminal at 8 in the morning with the look of a man delivering news he hadn't asked to carry. He told Ryan that HR had requested he refrain from accessing the equipment storage corridor until the investigation was formally closed. He said it carefully, the way people say things, when they're trying to sound neutral and know they're failing. Ryan told him he understood and went back to the intake logs without pushing back. There was nothing to be gained from making Greg's morning harder than it already was. What Ryan couldn't control was the conversation happening everywhere else. By midday, the version of events circulating through the office had already drifted from what the footage actually showed. People weren't lying exactly. They were just filling in the gaps the way humans always do instinctively, using whatever materials were available. And the materials available for Ryan Cole were not flattering. He drove an old truck. He never joined team lunches. He didn't own anything that suggested a comfortable financial situation. Someone mentioned with the careful phrasing of a person who wants to sound objective that it wasn't a stretch to imagine a man in his position being tempted by something worth $4,000. Nobody disagreed out loud. Nobody needed to. The security team brought in the footage for a second review that afternoon, this time with Victoria Hale present, and 2 members of the HR department seated alongside her. Paul Greer walked them through it frame by frame, using a larger monitor in the security office, and the enhanced version was worse for Ryan than the original had been. The image was clearer. The angle showed his arm extended, his hand closing around something at the edge of the shelf, the object tucked against his body, as he turned away from the camera. Whatever he was carrying it deliberately. That much was undeniable. Victoria watched the footage twice without speaking. Then she asked Paul Greer whether the clipboard Ryan had mentioned was visible anywhere in the recording. Paul told her it wasn't. Not clearly. The shelf unit was partially outside the camera's frame, and the object Ryan picked up was too small and too close to his body to identify with certainty from this angle. He said it with the honesty of someone who understood the limits of what the equipment could tell them. But the answer landed the way it landed. Not visible meant not confirmed, and not confirmed meant Ryan's entire defense rested on a system log that anyone with warehouse access could theoretically have manipulated. One of the HR managers, a woman named Sandra Wyatt, noted this aloud, with the specific kind of diplomatic phrasing that functions as a conclusion dressed up as a question. She said they couldn't rule out the possibility that the log entry had been made retroactively. She said it gently. She said it once. But once was enough. Ryan was called in the following morning and told that pending the outcome of the investigation, he was being placed on administrative suspension with pay. Sandra Wyatt delivered this information across a conference table with a printed document already prepared, which told Ryan everything he needed to know about how much the meeting was actually open to discussion. He was told not to report to the warehouse. He was told the company would be in contact within 5 to 7 business days. He was told that this was standard procedure and did not constitute a formal finding of guilt. Ryan looked at the document, looked at Sandra, and signed where she indicated. He drove home in the old truck and sat in the parking lot of his apartment building for a while without going inside. The suspension itself wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was the particular quality of silence that follows being removed from a place you've given years to the sudden absence of routine, of purpose, of the small frictions that make a day feel like something real. Ryan had built his life around structure because structure was the one thing that didn't require money or connection or the right last name. Now even that was gone, replaced by days of waiting in an apartment with a faulty heating unit and a stack of bills that weren't going anywhere. He spent the first day going through the system logs from his personal access records pulling every timestamp that could corroborate his account. The correction he had made to the inventory count on the morning in question was logged at 7:44, 2 minutes after the timestamp on the footage, which made perfect sense if you understood that he would have checked the physical shelf first before entering the correction digitally. The sequence was logical. The data was clean. He compiled everything into a document and emailed it to Sandra Wyatt with a subject line that said simply, "Supporting documentation. Ryan Cole." Sandra replied the next afternoon with 4 sentences, acknowledging receipt and confirming the material would be reviewed as part of the investigation. Nothing more. Meanwhile, on the other side of the building, Derek Sims had quietly inserted himself into the situation in the way that certain skilled people do by offering to help. He told Victoria he was happy to assist the security team cross-reference the equipment logs from his department, since the scanner had originally been routed through operations before being transferred to the storage room. Victoria accepted the offer because Derek was thorough and available, and because trusting him had never given her a reason to reconsider. What nobody mentioned, because nobody had thought to look, was that Derek's name had come up twice in the past 4 months, in connection with fixed assets logged as misplaced. Both cases had been written off as administrative errors. Both had stopped being investigated the moment Derek volunteered to help close them out. Nobody thought to question what he might have to gain from being close to this investigation. That was the thing about a man like Derek Sims. The question simply didn't occur to people. By the 4th day of Ryan's suspension, the evidence as officially understood had not changed. The footage showed what it showed. The clipboard remained unverifiable by camera. The log entry remained theoretically disputable, and the quiet consensus that had formed in the first hours after the all-staff meeting had only solidified in the days since, not loudly, not cruelly, but in the particular way of institutional belief, where a conclusion repeated often enough begins to feel like something that was always true. Greg Halford sent Ryan a short text on the 5th day that said he was rooting for him. Ryan read it twice and didn't respond. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because he didn't know what to say to someone whose support existed entirely outside the walls of the place where it would have actually mattered. On the morning of the 6th day, Sandra Wyatt called Ryan and told him that HR had completed its preliminary review and that the findings had been submitted to Victoria Hale for a final decision. She said Victoria would be issuing a formal determination by end of business the following day. She used the word determination in the careful way that people use words when they don't want to say what they mean, and Ryan understood the shape of what was coming even before she finished the sentence. He asked directly whether the documentation he had submitted had been considered. Sandra told him it had been reviewed. She did not tell him what the review had concluded. Ryan spent that night going over everything again: the log entries, the timestamps, the geometry of the camera angle, the exact position of the secondary shelf unit relative to the storage room door. He had been in that hallway for 41 seconds. He had picked up the clipboard. In the first 20 seconds, made a visual check of the shelf and walked away. The scanner had still been in the storage room. At that point, he was certain of it. The way a person is certain of things that were unremarkable at the time, precisely because nothing about them suggested they needed to be remembered. But certainty, he was learning, was a private thing. It lived only inside the person who held it, and it transferred to no one unless someone was willing to receive it. The following morning, Ryan put on a clean shirt and drove to the office. Nobody had asked him to come in. His suspension was still technically active, but Sandra's call had made it clear that a decision was being made today, and he had decided that if his career was going to end, it wasn't going to end while he was sitting alone in an apartment waiting for an email. He told the front desk he was there to speak with HR before any formal determination was issued. The woman at the desk made a call, spoke quietly into the phone, and then told him to wait in the lobby. He waited for 22 minutes. Then a different HR coordinator came down and told him with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering a script that Victoria Hale was currently in a meeting and that her determination would be communicated through official channels as previously indicated. Ryan was asked politely, but without room for negotiation, to return home. He stood there for a moment. He could see through the glass wall of the second-floor conference room the outline of Victoria Hale seated at the head of the table. He couldn't tell who else was in the room. He could only see her hand moving across a document on the table in front of her, the deliberate motion of someone signing something they had already decided to sign. Ryan thanked the coordinator and walked back out through the front doors. The cold air outside hit him flat and direct. He stood on the sidewalk without moving for a long moment, looking at the building he had given 3 years to without once being late, and without once being thanked for it. He had done everything right. He had documented everything. He had told the truth in a room full of people who had already chosen not to believe him. And now the woman with the pen was inside, and he was out here, and there was nothing left to do but wait for what he already knew was coming. The formal termination letter had been drafted, signed, and was sitting in Sandra Wyatt's outbox, scheduled to send at 5 o'clock that afternoon. The language was clean and legally precise, the way HR documents always are when a company has done this enough times to know exactly how to say the thing they are saying without saying it plainly. Sandra had not yet hit send. She was waiting out of procedural habit for a final confirmation from Victoria's office before the clock ran out. What nobody had accounted for was Paul Greer working late. Paul was not a man who operated on instinct. He was methodical by nature, and by training the kind of person who checked things twice, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood that certainty was earned, not assumed. He had been the one to pull the original footage. He had been the one to present the enhanced version to Victoria and Sandra 2 days earlier, and something about that presentation had stayed with him, not loudly, but persistently, like a sound you can't quite identify. The thing that bothered him was the angle. The camera outside the equipment storage corridor was positioned at the far end of the hallway, angled to cover the storage room door and the immediate surrounding area. It was the primary camera for that section, but the building had a secondary camera, a wider angle unit mounted at the opposite end of the corridor, installed 18 months ago as part of a general security upgrade, primarily intended to cover the stairwell exit. That camera's footage had not been pulled during the original review, because the storage room door fell at the edge of its frame, and Paul had made the reasonable judgment at the time that the primary camera offered a cleaner view. He pulled the secondary footage now on his own time at 6:47 in the evening, sitting alone in the security office with a cold cup of coffee and the low hum of the building's ventilation system for company. The timestamp he queued up was 7:42, the same moment the primary camera had captured Ryan Cole in the hallway. From the secondary angle, the view was wider, and the shelf unit Ryan had approached was more fully visible. Paul leaned forward in his chair. Ryan reached down to the lower section of the shelf, picked up something flat and rectangular, glanced at it briefly, and then walked away down the corridor in the direction of the main warehouse floor. The object in his hand had straight edges and a dark surface. It was a clipboard. There was no ambiguity from this angle. The clipboard was visible, clearly distinct from anything resembling the prototype scanner, and Ryan had carried it away from the storage room, not toward it. Paul sat with that for a moment. Then he kept watching. At 7:44, 2 minutes after Ryan had left the frame matching exactly the timestamp on Ryan's inventory log correction, a second figure appeared in the corridor from the stairwell direction. The secondary camera caught this clearly because the stairwell was exactly what it had been installed to monitor. The figure moved with purpose, not the casual stride of someone passing through, but the deliberate pace of someone who knew where they were going and wanted to get there and leave quickly. The figure stopped at the storage room door, used a key card to enter, and emerged 43 seconds later. The figure's posture on exit was subtly different, slightly more forward-weighted, the way a person's posture shifts when they're carrying something pressed against their body. Paul Greer recognized the figure before he finished the thought. It was Derek Sims. Paul sat completely still for a long moment, watching the timestamp count forward on the screen. Then he picked up his desk phone and called Victoria Hale's cell directly, which he had never done before in 6 years of working for the company. She answered on the third ring. Victoria arrived at the security office 11 minutes later. She had been in her car in the parking garage about to drive home, and she walked back into the building with her coat still on and her expression composed in the specific way of someone who has learned to keep their face neutral when they don't yet know what they're about to be told. Paul walked her through the secondary footage without commentary. He let the recording do the talking. Ryan and the clipboard at 7:42. Derek Sims and the storage room door at 7:44. The keycard entry log that confirmed the access, the posture on exit. When it finished, he pulled up the keycard system and showed her that Derek's credentials had been used to access the storage room 3 times in the 72 hours before the scanner was reported missing, and once more the time they had just watched after Ryan had already left the corridor. Then Paul pulled up something else. 2 asset reports from the previous 4 months, both flagged as administrative errors, both involving equipment logged under Derek's department access. Both cases had been closed out after Derek himself had volunteered to investigate them. At the time, it had looked like diligence. Sitting here now with the keycard logs open on the same screen, it looked like something else entirely. Victoria watched all of it. She did not interrupt. She absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, fully quietly, with the particular stillness of someone whose understanding of a situation is undergoing a structural change rather than a surface correction. When Paul finished, she asked one question. Why wasn't the secondary camera included in the original review? Paul told her the truth. He had made a judgment call based on image clarity and hadn't gone back to re-examine the assumption. He said it without hedging because there was no point in hedging. Victoria nodded once and told him to compile everything. Both camera recordings, the keycard logs, the asset reports, the timestamps into a single documented file. Then she asked him to contact Derek Sims and have him in the building within the hour. She also asked him to call Ryan Cole, and she told Sandra Wyatt in a message sent at 7:12 in the evening not to send the termination letter. Derek arrived first. He walked into the security office with the confident ease of a man who had received the call and decided the best strategy was to appear unconcerned. He greeted Paul with his usual warmth, the automatic friendliness of someone who has spent years making every room feel like a room he belongs in. Then he saw the monitors and the expression on Victoria's face, and the warmth went somewhere else. Victoria did not waste time. She played him the footage. She showed him the keycard logs. She asked him in the same flat administrative tone she had used when she called Ryan to stand up days earlier to explain what he had been doing in that corridor at 7:44 on Tuesday morning. Derek was good. He offered an explanation involving a last-minute check on equipment he had been tracking for the vendor evaluation. He said he hadn't thought to mention it because he hadn't considered it relevant. He said it with the practiced fluency of someone who had already considered the possibility of this conversation and prepared accordingly. Victoria listened to all of it. Then she told him the scanner had been found. This was the part Derek hadn't prepared for. The security team, cross-referencing the keycard logs Paul had pulled, had located the scanner 40 minutes before Derek arrived, locked in a secondary storage cabinet in the operations wing, a cabinet that fell under Derek's department access and that had no documented reason to contain vendor equipment. The same cabinet held 2 other company assets that had been logged as misplaced over the past 4 months, the same cases Derek had personally closed out. Derek's fluency stopped working somewhere in the middle of his next sentence. Victoria let him finish it anyway. Then she told him the meeting was over, that his access credentials had been suspended effective immediately, and that legal and HR would be in contact with him to begin formal termination proceedings. She asked him to leave the building. He left. He did not look like the same man who had walked in. Ryan arrived 20 minutes after Derek had gone. He had been at home when Paul called, sitting at the kitchen table with his documentation spread out in front of him, for what felt like the 100th time, going through timestamps, that already said everything they were going to say. He had driven to the office in the old truck, parked in the same spot he always used, and walked through the front doors with the particular composure of someone who has already accepted the worst outcome and is no longer afraid of it. Paul met him in the lobby and brought him to the security office. Victoria was still there. She stood when Ryan came in, which was not something she had done in the conference room days earlier, and she did not ask him to sit down before she spoke. She told him what the secondary footage had shown. She told him about the keycard logs, about the scanner, about Derek Sims. She walked through it in order, factually, the way she walked through everything, except that there was something different in the way she was standing now. It wasn't discomfort exactly. It was closer to accountability, the particular posture of someone who understands that the accurate thing to do is not the comfortable thing. When she finished, she said, "The suspension is rescinded effective immediately. Your record will reflect no finding of wrongdoing. I'll be sending a formal written statement to that effect, and I'd like to address the full staff tomorrow morning." Ryan looked at her for a moment. "The clipboard was on the lower shelf," he said. "I logged the inventory correction at 7:44. The sequence was always there." "It was," Victoria said. "We didn't look for it." There was a particular kind of honesty in saying "we" rather than I and Ryan registered it without comment. She had a room full of data analysts and a security team and years of experience building a company that ran on precision, and she had looked at 17 seconds of footage and a man in a worn jacket and decided she already had what she needed. The secondary camera had been in the building for 18 months. Nobody had thought to check it, because nobody had needed to. They had already found their answer. "I want to ask you something," Victoria said. The formal tone had shifted into something less rehearsed. "Why didn't you say more in the meeting? You had the log entry, you had the sequence. Why did you only say what you said and sit back down?" Ryan considered the question. "Because I'd already told the truth," he said. "I didn't think saying it louder would make it more true." Victoria didn't respond to that immediately. She looked at the monitors, dark. Now, the footage no longer running, and then back at Ryan, and something in her expression underwent a quiet recalibration, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes the shape of everything that follows. The all-staff meeting the next morning was different from the one days before. The room was the same. The chairs filled the same way, but Victoria stood at the front without a tablet and without a prepared document, and she said in plain language what had happened and what had been found and what had been wrong. She said Ryan Cole had been wrongly accused on the basis of incomplete evidence and a set of assumptions that the company's leadership, including herself, had been too willing to accept. She said Derek Sims had been formally terminated and that legal proceedings were underway. She said Ryan's suspension had been fully rescinded and that she expected his colleagues to treat his return accordingly. She did not make it into a speech. She did not close with anything that sounded like a lesson. She said what needed to be said, and then she ended the meeting. Ryan was standing near the back of the room. He watched people absorb it, the recalibration happening in real time across 40 faces, the small visible adjustments that come when a story people had settled into gets corrected without warning. Some of them looked at him directly, some of them didn't. Greg Halford caught his eye from across the room and gave a single nod, the kind that doesn't require any words around it. Ryan nodded back. Then the meeting ended, and people filed out, and the room began to empty. Victoria walked toward him as the last few people were leaving. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to be direct, far enough to give him room. "I owe you a genuine apology," she said. "Not the institutional kind, a real one. I looked at the evidence through a lens I didn't examine, and a person's livelihood nearly paid for that." Ryan looked at her steadily. He thought about the days in the apartment. He thought about Sandra Wyatt's 4-sentence email. He thought about standing outside this building, watching Victoria's hand move across a document through a glass wall, and the cold air, and the feeling of having done everything right, and been seen as something else entirely. "I know," he said. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't refusal either. It was just the truth, stated simply, which was the only way Ryan Cole had ever known how to speak. He walked back to the warehouse floor, clocked in, and opened the intake logs. The inventory count from days ago still had an outstanding correction. He pulled it up, verified the numbers, and filed the adjustment the same way he had filed every adjustment for 3 years, quietly, accurately, without waiting for acknowledgement. The work was still the work. The building was still the building. And he was still the man who showed up before everyone else, not because anyone noticed, but because that was who he was when nobody was watching. Victoria Hale made 2 changes in the weeks that followed. The first was procedural. The security review protocol was updated to require footage from all available camera angles before any employee action could be taken based on visual evidence alone. The second change was harder to quantify and harder to write into a policy document, but more consequential than the first. She started asking different questions before she formed conclusions, not just what does the data show, but what does the data not yet show, and who stands to be affected by what I assume in the gap between those 2 things. It didn't make her less decisive. It made her more accurate, and sometimes accuracy is the only form of justice that actually arrives in time to matter.